I'd like to now welcome Michelangelo, who's from the Birdwood National Motor Museum. And while I don't know what he's going to talk about, it interests me because it's worth holding on to.
G'day everyone. What I will be talking about actually follows on very well from what Gary was talking about, because it is preserving and displaying Australia's automotive industrial heritage. I'll argue for the importance of preserving tangible and intangible heritage of an industry that, particularly in the case of Holden, can trace its origins in the country to the mid-19th century. I'll examine the effects on public memory of the fate of the industrial heritage, particularly the communities directly connected with automotive manufacturing, and describe preservation strategies for this heritage. Given the National Motor Museum, which is the building pictured there, its location in South Australia and its long-standing connection with the company, the paper will centre primarily on the fate of the industrial heritage of Holden's Elizabeth plant. However, Gary has given a very good rundown of most of the other plants in the country. But it also invites a discussion that involves heritage professionals around the country about how best to ensure a future, at least in public memory, for an industry that has helped to shape contemporary Australia. So, even though most of you are quite familiar with it, first I'll give a little background on Australia's automotive industry. Australia has long prided itself on being one of the few countries in the world to build passenger cars from the ground up. The mass production of automobiles in Australia began over 100 years ago with T.J. Richards' Motor Body Workshop in Adelaide, building its first body in 1914, quickly followed by Holden and Frost in 1917. And that's the old Holden and Frost saddlery business. Holden, in fact, had been operating as a saddler since 1856 and later transitioned into car upholstery work and then built entire car bodies. So in this sense, the roots of the industry have been present in the country for over 160 years. Ford began assembling entire automobiles in Australia from its Geelong factory in 1925, and only a few years later, General Motors entered the Australian market as well, buying out Holden and Frost and renaming it GM Holden. In 1948, the Holden 48215, or FX as it was more commonly known, arguably became the first car to be entirely mass-produced in Australia. And then a golden era followed, with Chrysler also entering the market in 1951 when it took over T.J. Richards, and steadily increasing production from the three large manufacturers until around 1980. And since then, oil crises and increasing competition from other manufacturers, particularly Japanese and Southeast Asian, have combined to cripple the local industry, which, despite years of government intervention, had become unsustainable for the multinational companies operating in Australia. Mitsubishi announced the end of operations in 2008, and eventually Ford, Holden and Toyota all followed suit. So by the end of 2017, in a way, all that will be left of car manufacturing in Australia is its heritage. First, I'll talk a little bit about industrial heritage and public memory. So public memory is a concept that is most commonly associated with the commemoration of death, war, atrocities, and other trauma. But in fact, the urban landscapes like that of Detroit and possibly soon of Elizabeth, these abandoned plants act as memorials to a part of the community's social, industrial, and cultural lives that is gone forever. So seldom, if ever framed in this way, they are in every sense the lieux de mémoire, or places of memory, that are defined by influential French historian Pierre Nora in his studies on memory. So he defines them as places which have become symbolic elements of the memorial heritage of a community. This link between industrial heritage and the collective memory and identity of a community is articulated in the International Committee for the Conservation of Industrial Heritage, long name, but they're abbreviated to TICI, their Nizhny Charter for Industrial Heritage. So industrial heritage is one of the areas of cultural heritage not specifically identified in the UNESCO World Heritage Convention of 1972, but which has since been promoted by UNESCO as a category of World Heritage in its own right. So that special committee, TICI, was formed in 1973 to advise UNESCO on industrial heritage. And their charter identifies the significance of industrial heritage, highlighting that its value is not only technological and scientific, and in some cases aesthetic, but primarily social, as part of the ordinary lives of men and women, and as such providing an important sense of identity. The Charter does not simply concern itself with defining the significance of industrial heritage, but provides frameworks for its legal protection maintenance and conservation, education and training and presentation and interpretation. As the most important internationally recognized document concerning the preservation of industrial heritage, parts of the Charter are going to be referenced throughout this paper. So the legal protection section, for example, makes specific mention of communities threatened by the change in store for places like Elizabeth and Geelong, when it says that industrial communities which are threatened by rapid structural change should be supported by central and local government authorities. Potential threats to the industrial heritage from such changes should be anticipated and plans prepared to avoid the need for emergency actions. While these guidelines are intended to apply to a diverse spectrum of industrial heritage, in fact, the sites recognized as industrial World Heritage Sites by UNESCO are for the majority connected to the first industrial revolution or our earlier wonders of engineering, like the Roman aqueduct of Pont du Gard in France, for example. A 2001 survey of these sites recognized by UNESCO revealed that those associated with mining and transport and specialized structures like dams and hydraulic works made up just about all the industrial heritage sites inscribed on UNESCO's list. No manufacturing sites featured on the list at all. And since that study in 2001, I've identified 2 manufacturing sites that have been added to the list, a shoe factory in Germany and the Van Melle factory in the Netherlands. But they were both selected primarily for their architectural significance. Though inscription on UNESCO's World Heritage Register is simply the most prestigious of the many ways that a heritage place can secure conservation status, the lack of manufacturing sites on the list is indicative of a global tendency to not devote sufficient attention to this category of industrial heritage. The importance of these places of memory in urban landscapes has not been recognized and preserved with the same dedication reserved for places linked to military, religious, or other types of cultural heritage. In the following section, I'll demonstrate this further with a specific focus on automotive heritage by examining the case of Detroit, the historical capital of car manufacturing in the United States, or the Motor City. And that is, in fact, the same Packard factory. That is one of the urban porn photos that Greg was talking about, Gary, sorry. So the spectacular decline of Detroit's automotive industry is well documented. Once proudly flaunting the moniker of Motor City as the home of automotive industry giants like Chrysler and General Motors, Detroit's fortunes were inextricably linked with those of these companies. Already struggling to compete in the global markets in the 1970s, these manufacturers were dealt a huge blow by the GFC of 2008, and having flourished for decades with the activity from manufacturing plants operating all over the city, the entire city of Detroit was declared bankrupt in 2013. Just prior, both Chrysler and GM had filed for bankruptcy, and the loss of jobs in the automotive industry was the main cause of the city's population dropping to around 700,000 in 2013, which is less than half the inhabitants that it had 50 years prior. So with such a slow but steady decline, it is not surprising that hardly any efforts were made to salvage the physical heritage of a vanishing industry. A 2012 architectural survey of Detroit highlighted the extent of loss of this automotive heritage. It found that of 15 major automotive plants that were operating in the city in 1980, only 7 remained standing in 2012. So in 32 years, over half of them had gone. Of these, only 5 retained any resemblance to their original aspect, and only 2 were still operational. But for a city that identified so heavily with the automotive industry, the impact of this rapid loss of industrial heritage has been so significant that Detroit's city centre has been flagged as risking suburbanization, so a literal loss of identity as the actual centre of the town. The survey also identified principal ways in which the automotive industrial built heritage was lost in Detroit. So it was either through demolition, for redevelopment by the manufacturers themselves, or for economic development of the land following factory closures, or just through plain neglect. This is the case of the Packard factory, which has been largely abandoned for almost 60 years and which has since been recently acquired with plans of future redevelopment. The survey went on to suggest 3 preservation alternatives: non-profit stewardship, reuse as premises for startup industries, which is something we see increasingly in Australian towns, and DIY use or unstructured use by artists, small businesses, and local residents. So on the Australian front, the site most likely to be targeted for conservation discussions is Holden's main assembly plant in Elizabeth, since Ford's Geelong plant is soon to be redeveloped into the company's Asia Pacific Product Development Centre, and a similar repurposing is scheduled for Toyota's Altona plant. The fate of the Elizabeth plant, on the other hand, is still undecided, despite numerous rumours of local and foreign investors interested in purchasing it to continue producing cars using the existing setup. The factory is prominently situated in the working class suburb of Elizabeth in Adelaide's northern suburbs. Construction began in 1958, only 3 years after Elizabeth was first established. It currently employs well over 1,000 people, and it has arguably been the main driver of Elizabeth's economic and social development since it was first opened. Adjacent is the 650-hectare Edinburgh Parks industrial estate, which in 1997 was established by government authorities to encourage the concentration of businesses associated with the car industry. Only around half of the estate was ever developed, and many of its occupants will likely be forced to close or at least substantially scale down operations once Holden ceases building vehicles. But while the factory's significance as a symbolic element of the memorial heritage of Elizabeth is evident, a suitable approach to its preservation is far less clear. Should Holden succeed in finding a buyer for the site, the economical and political situation makes it almost impossible to prevent a total redevelopment of the plant. This is likely to result in the destruction of much of its historical fabric, a process already witnessed with the closure of Holden's Woodville plant, with little remaining of the factory opened in 1924, where many of Australia's most significant vehicles were manufactured. If the Elizabeth factory remains unsolved, however, the preservation alternatives listed earlier must be considered and judged in relation to predetermined conservation objectives and to available resources. For example, while non-profit stewardship by a governmental or a non-governmental historical association, like a museum, for example, may guarantee the best documentation and the best interpretation of the site, it may also result in inadequate maintenance due to lack of sufficient economic resources. On the other hand, reuse of the site as a hub for startup industries, which is a model already used in many heritage sites around the world, may result in the best physical preservation of the site, but it may weaken the connection to the automotive industry through its repurposing. And finally, the DIY use model could presumably lead to both inadequate physical conservation and a weakening of the site's connection to car manufacturing, but it may also provide a renewed social significance to the Elizabeth community of the Holden site. This particular consideration is spelled out in the Ticking Charter, which states that continuing to adapt and use industrial buildings avoids wasting energy and contributes to sustainable development. Industrial heritage can have an important role in the economic regeneration of decayed or declining areas. The continuity that reuse implies may provide psychological stability for communities facing the sudden end of long-standing sources of employment. So whatever the chosen course of action, implementation must necessarily follow the ceasing of Holden's operations and the determination of whether another business will continue using the site for manufacturing. The time leading up to these decisions should be devoted to economic and social studies, exploring the options described earlier, in order to draft a plan of action as early as possible. So I'll now touch on the role that Australian museums, and the National Motor Museum in particular, should play in heritage preservation, irrespective of the fate of the factory sites. To that in a moment. Whatever the fate of the factory buildings after their life ceases as automotive manufacturing centres, on-site conservation alone cannot suffice to preserve Australia's industrial heritage. Again, the Charter identifies the importance of sustaining public interest. So it states that public interest and affection for the industrial heritage and appreciation of its values are the surest ways to conserve it. Public authorities should actively explain the meaning and value of industrial sites through publications, exhibitions, television, the internet and other media, by providing sustainable access to important sites and by promoting tourism in industrial areas. So as centres committed to preserving and exhibiting the nation's motoring heritage, Australian motor museums must play their part in ensuring our automotive manufacturing history's long-term presence in the public sphere. The development of public exhibitions dedicated to car manufacturing in Australia is one of the main ways that motor museums, and other museums in fact, can promote an ongoing engagement between the Australian public and this important aspect of the country's social, economic and technological history. In particular, building online resources on the subject that are easily accessible from classrooms is important to ensure sustained education on the automotive industry. Exhibition development is reliant on the existence of sound historical records, So the opportunity must be taken to bolster the existing resources by documenting those important aspects of automotive manufacturing before they begin to fade from memory, before the factories actually close down. So for example, the National Motor Museum has held discussions with Holden around filming assembly line processes at Elizabeth. The resulting videos are to be used in the development of a proposed new exhibition on Australian vehicle manufacturing, which is also planned around the salvage of part of the Elizabeth plant assembly line. This is one of the main things that we are proposing. In situ preservation of the machinery in an automotive assembly plant requires significant economic resources, which are likely to far outweigh the viability of keeping the plant open as a visitor-centred experience. So as an alternative, the National Motor Museum has proposed an ambitious project to preserve a section of the GM Holden vehicle assembly line conveyor from the Elizabeth plant as a static display in the Motor Museum's Pavilion of Australian Motoring. The display is to convey to the museum visitors an appreciation of the equipment and processes involved in the staged progressive assembly of a motor vehicle. The project is to accompany a new exhibition on automotive manufacturing in Australia, which will cover the industry's history from its earliest days to the end of production in 2017. So you can see that's a mock-up of what it would look like with the assembly line mounted from the roof in the museum's main exhibition space. With the closure of the vehicle manufacturing facilities at Elizabeth, the opportunity to acquire sections of the assembly equipment for erection as a permanent display at the museum has been proposed. By preserving a section of the assembly equipment, visitors to the museum will gain a physical appreciation of the process of manufacturing vehicles that cannot be conveyed by viewing photographs or videos alone. GM Holden management has been supportive of this proposal, and a section of the overhead assembly conveyor has been identified for possible donation to the museum. This section of conveyor is utilised for the assembly of vehicles inclusive of the engine and axle powertrain, and whilst details of the final arrangement are yet to be determined for our display, the functionality of the conveyor's construction will allow for a variety of options to be considered. Part of the decommissioning and deconstruction process of the GMH Holden Elizabeth plant involves the proposal to dismantle the selected sections of the Eisenman EMS conveyor from the General Assembly plant, inclusive of carriers, monorail, and supporting steelwork, which is effectively what you see in those drawings. The equipment would then be transported to the NMM in Birdwood for reassembly as a static overhead display in the main pavilion. Prior to the assembly of the conveyor system at Birdwood, a number of modifications and additions of supporting steelwork must be undertaken to facilitate the erection of the conveyor system and vehicle bodies. The design modifications required will be based on the original Holden designs, but tailored to suit the requirements of the National Motor Museum structure and the conveyor's display specs. To facilitate the execution of this project, project management and engineering services will be required to undertake the planning, design, and construction, and to ensure compliant and cost-effective delivery of the desired outcomes. The National Motor Museum has engaged the services of former Holden project manager responsible for the conveyor's installation and the structural engineering consultant responsible for supporting steelwork designs. And these key professionals will lead the project through the concept, planning, design, and execution phases. While the overhead conveyor represents the normal operational installation in the manufacturing plant, it will not actually enable museum visitors to see into the vehicles on the carriers. So by erecting an elevated walkway, which is not actually shown in those drawings, adjacent to the overhead conveyor, visitors could take the opportunity to look inside the vehicle bodies. Many of the world's large car manufacturers offer factory tours, though these clearly showcase manufacturing operations that are very much live. So other museums include manufacturing exhibitions in their permanent galleries, but they don't have displays of actual machinery. The only experience similar to the one that we're proposing exists in Nagoya's Toyota Commemorative Museum of Industry and Technology, where an early Toyota assembly line is partially recreated. And you can see it there. That's in Nagoya. So while that's very much meant to show what a 80-year-old production line looks like, we're probably the only museum proposing to showcase relatively up-to-date production line looks like. I'll just touch on the intangible heritage, so Australia's automotive manufacturing skills and how those can be preserved. The implications of Australia's motoring heritage of the departure of the automotive industry could be further reaching still. So one of the largest motor museums in the country, the Ford Discovery Centre in Geelong, was forced to close in 2012 as Ford's economic crisis deepened. Meanwhile, the National Motor Museum, which once benefited from a lucrative sponsorship deal with Holden, has in recent years had to rely increasingly on self-generated income and shrinking government funding to fulfil its mission to preserve and display automotive heritage. This reduced level of funding has resulted in lower staffing and less capacity to perform routine maintenance and interventive conservation work on the collections. Thus, even the long-term integrity of the vehicles already designated as significant cultural heritage by their inclusion in our collection is threatened by Australia's automotive industry collapse. Maintenance operations at Turin's National Motor Museum highlight even further the benefits that a lively manufacturing industry can have on automotive heritage. The staff required to perform routine maintenance on the collection is a team of 3 working 2 full days per week. Each of the staff has a particular area of specialization, such as previous training in carpentry or as electricians, which was complemented by intensive training at Fiat's Costruzioni Sperimentali, their experimental concept development division, to specialize in vehicle upkeep. Training with Fiat's concept development division provides invaluable experience in maintaining or repairing vehicles that are often one of a kind. Meanwhile, in Australia, the skill to perform bespoke repairs, particularly to vehicle bodies, is fast becoming obsolete. In fact, the discussion so far has centered around preserving the automotive industry's tangible heritage, which is at risk of rapid destruction, but an even bigger challenge is preserving the intangible heritage associated with the automotive industry. To focus on preserving vehicle repair skills in particular, the National Motor Museum has recently undertaken a partnership with the TAFE to provide its automotive body repair students the opportunity to work on vehicles that are part of our museum collection. It's an elective option for students who, supervised by TAFE teaching staff, can develop panel beating and painting skills that are not in demand in the crash repair workshops where the majority of them are likely to work, but which are highly valued by Australia's historic vehicle owners. Initiatives such as this, and in particular any which focus on manufacturing skills as opposed to just repair, must be encouraged for this intangible heritage associated with the automotive industry to have any hope of living in the near future. But the period immediately following the end of automotive manufacturing will be one in which public interest in the subject is at its absolute peak. Historians and heritage professionals must take advantage of this time to maximise attendance at public exhibitions and use of any resources created for public use. The time leading up to the closures is probably the best and perhaps only chance to devise and enact preservation strategies. These should take into account the situation in the communities with long-standing connections to automotive manufacturing and ensure that heritage projects, whether collecting projects or exhibitive, involve members of these communities and are easily accessible by them. Furthermore, those wishing to undertake heritage projects can rely on the availability of management and staff at the factories about to close, who generally value the interest displayed in their work. In fact, coordinated efforts between heritage professionals, affected communities, and the automotive industry itself are likely to yield the best results for preservation strategies that are effective and sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelangelo. A very thought-provoking talk, and I'm sure there's going to be much discussion in the next 12 months, particularly in South Australia. Do we have a question?
Thanks for that most interesting and thought-provoking paper. I was reflecting on that display at Ford Discovery Centre, which you mentioned towards the end, because my recollection is it had a little element of the manufacturing assembly line represented, probably in a lot smaller scale than you're envisaging, but I'm assuming with the closure of that centre, that equipment and everything's just all been thrown out and gone by the wayside. And so my question is really about, as a museum curator or part of the museum team, the importance of actually that initial documentation and videoing, or whatever you're doing, to really thoroughly document the actual production line and its processes and its development in situ, because obviously you're only going to acquire a small element of it or a representative part of it, so that the bit that you actually collect, you consciously understand why you're collecting the bit you're collecting and what its benefits or potential is in the longer term, not just, with the shortages of funding and things like that, the immediate expediency is often just to work out what you want to put on display and how you're going to get on display. What I'm sort of highlighting is the importance of doing that thorough documentation so that when your display's had a 10 or 20 year lifespan, it's not just going to be assigned to the landfill as well, but it's going to be seen as a really fundamental part of our ongoing heritage and worth preserving for what it represents.
Yeah, that's an excellent comment. And in fact, in a way, in terms of historical accuracy, I think the videoing of operations is probably more important. And in fact, we were discussing what's going to happen with our, if this does actually happen. It was interesting that Matthew, who's been working on this more than I have, he was probably more interested in having an extremely accurate depiction of how the assembly line at Elizabeth works, which is cars in all stages of production being in the same space effectively, whereas the average museum visitor would probably benefit more from seeing vehicle 10% complete, 20% complete, 30% complete, which isn't actually how it works. In a sense, this is more to create interest, to stimulate visitors in maintaining the interest alive so that, I guess, it stays in the public sphere and in the public conscience.
Daryl, did that go to the other Geelong museum?
I don't believe so. No.
Thank you. Given that the current production line at Elizabeth has probably been designed with CAD and the digital systems, have you got a program to try and capture the digital archive that goes with it? And I'm wondering too whether amongst that might be animated 3D digital depictions of the operation of the production line, which would be a fabulous resource for interpretation.
Holden definitely, I don't know if it's a nationwide thing between other plants or if it's just in Elizabeth, but they've just set up a heritage committee, which we are just about to join, so we haven't actually been on any of the meetings yet, so I don't exactly know where we stand with that just yet. So far I've noticed that it's a GM is still a company that are going to operate, and there is still a level of secrecy around that kind of thing. I'm not sure how much we will be allowed to collect and how much we will want to collect, but certainly there's there's more to it. There is all the digital stuff that will certainly be of interest. I can't answer just yet how much of the archives will be retained.
Sorry, we can continue the discussion later.
Thank you, Michelangelo. Would you put your hands together?